First of all, I'd like to thank OGMizen for actually responding to my snarky comments on That Guy T's video. I didn't expect that. And as I said in one of the comments, this is the video response that I'm going to make. There are actually several arguments against veganism, which I think independently can undermine the argument for ethical veganism, and I'll lay those out, or try to. OGMizen actually made 3 primary arguments that I saw in the video. The first was that humans suffer in the making of meat, therefore if you care about human suffering, you should be against the production of meat. I think That Guy T did a pretty good job of undermining this argument, or at least giving a alternative way out of it. The second argument was that there is no trait animals possess which, if humans possessed it, would allow humans to be killed like animals. And conversely, there is no trait that humans possess which, if animals possessed it, would require animals be treated as though they have rights which humans enjoy. I'm going to ignore the first argument. The second argument I will grant, and the third argument is what I will argue against. I think That Guy T also granted the second argument. Alright, so my first argument is this. Humans possess pain language, language of suffering specifically. They're beliefs that don't make sense to question. One of those beliefs is whether or not there are other minds. Through language, we don't simply know that others share our experience. It's the given that language is based off of. That it doesn't make sense to utter the sentence, "Do others exist?" It's a self-defeating premise that no one else exists, because a language doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's context, there is something shared, and shared requires multiple entities. Because we have correct usages of pain and suffering, language tells us that there's something undoubtable about the suffering of our fellow species members. A related example is that there are people born with a rare genetic disease called SIPA. It's an acronym, you can Google it. These people never feel physical pain. Pain, however, is a subjective experience. So it's not something you can teach just by showing it, like a baseball game. Therefore, people born with SIPA will always be justified in second-guessing whether they're talking about physical pain correctly, and will always be justified in thinking that they aren't using it correctly. Here's why. They will never know the meaning of physical pain because they can't experience it. To that extent, it makes no sense to say that they're using the word pain wrong. Before you teach someone the rules of baseball, they aren't playing baseball wrong as they run across the field doing somersaults. They're simply not playing baseball at all. The rules of suffering must exist and be known to others for the language game of suffering to be played. Other humans play the game. It's not clear that animals do. Other animals, specifically greater apes and dolphins, may use primitive language, but until we can talk with them or understand their language and decipher it, we're simply making educated guesses, but this evidence is much weaker than the foundational predicate on which language is itself based on. Other animals have like proto-languages. There is a good case against this line of reasoning The best case against this line of reasoning is someone either born with a severe mental disability or someone who receives a traumatic brain injury, which puts them in the same place as the person born with disability. That person, the second kind of person who receives a traumatic brain injury, may actually possess all of the internal workings of a person with language, but not be able to communicate it. And in that case, granted that we are certain that that's the case, they would of course be capable of suffering. Now, if you want to take the stronger case, that we were somehow certain that a person was either born or injured to the point where they are completely incapable of language or understanding it, it's not at all clear they would be capable of suffering the way we do. The suffering would be different in kind, perhaps, or maybe non-existent. They might be closer to someone who's brain dead, who we don't really think of as suffering at all. If there's an actual medical example that's relevant and shows somehow that someone is suffering emotionally, but just has no concept of pain, and this is a person, I'd be glad to see it, but otherwise just simply saying that someone could in fact receive a brain injury, and this would make them incapable of using language, yet they would still be able to suffer, is just begging the question. Then there is the repugnant conclusion. If animals have lives that are worth living, and that is a moral good, despite suffering they may endure during that lifetime, then a world maximally full of suffering animals may be better than a world with fewer animals who don't suffer by human hands at all. Another way to think of it is to score humans' goodness by the lack of suffering they cause in animals. Let's say a 0 is a human who tortures animals as much as he possibly can every waking moment while still attending his own needs for survival. And a 100 is a human who has never affected suffering in a non-human, despite ample opportunity. A 1 might be someone who relishes causing suffering to animals and does so frequently and to a great degree, but will on rare occasion pass up such an opportunity. The problem is, for any number of humans who are level 100 vegans, let's say, there is some greater number of level 1s, bastards, who the world would be better off with. Most people find this conclusion disagreeable, because you could end up with a world full of sadists that would be more moral than a world with a handful of perfectly behaved people. A related argument is that if you accept, 1, that there is no moral difference between the suffering of non-human species and humans, and 2, that human suffering is wrong, then there is some number of animals, let's say rats, that a person should save instead of a sweet, innocent little girl in a scenario where you can only save one or the other. Both of these seem to be counterexamples to the ethical veganism that OGMizen describes. So the strongest case against veganism, which relies on utilitarian ethics, is the argument for dogmatic skepticism. The example I'm using comes from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I'm going to change the wording and argument a bit to make it more applicable to the topic we're talking about, and in my opinion, a bit more intuitive. I'll have the link to the original argument in the description. The first premise is that I am only justified in believing that suffering in all animals is wrong if either that belief needs no argument to justify it, or if that belief does need an argument to justify it. These are the only two possibilities, and therefore it's definitional. The second premise is that I am never justified in believing that suffering in all animals is wrong without argument, because otherwise the door is open for anyone to assert a number of beliefs which are claimed to be justified despite not being argued for. For instance, you could assert that self-defense is moral, or I could assert that the defense of another is the only time violence is moral. These statements are at odds with each other, and the only way to find out which is superior and therefore justified is through argumentation. The third premise, therefore, is that I am only justified in believing that suffering in all animals is wrong if there is some argument to justify it. In other words, a justified moral belief cannot be justified unless it is the conclusion of a sound argument. An argument is sound if its premises imply the conclusion correctly, and each of the premises are true. There are three kinds of premises that are relevant to moral arguments and might be used to justify moral beliefs. The first is a premise that is itself a moral belief, i.e., pain in all animals is wrong. The second kind of premise is a normative premise. The second kind of premise is a normative premise, but a non-moral normative premise, such as one's premises ought to be consistent. The third kind of premise is neither moral nor normative, as in non-human animals have the capacity to suffer. Therefore, the fourth premise is that I am justified in believing that suffering in all animals is wrong due to premises which are either 1, neither normative nor moral, 2, normative but not moral, or 3, moral. Using the first type of premise, I might try to justify suffering in all animals is wrong with a number of facts, such as people desire to reduce suffering generally. Animals are capable of suffering. Animals, in fact, suffer at the hands of humans. However, the fifth premise is that no matter how many of these facts I list, you will never inferentially reach the conclusion that suffering in all animals is wrong. This is what is referred to as the is-ought dilemma, or the is-ought gap in moral philosophy. A version of this is G.E. Moore's naturalistic fallacy. Essentially, the idea is that no matter how many true things you say about how the world is, you are not therefore justified in saying how the world ought to be. A lot can be said here, which is why I might make a follow-up video on this premise alone. But for now, I think this is sufficient. For the second kind of premise, normative but not moral premises, I might try to use normative statements that seem themselves not to be moral statements in order to justify the belief that suffering in all animals is wrong. I might try and argue that since we can abstain from causing needless suffering in animals, and we ought to avoid causing needless suffering in animals, causing needless suffering in animals is therefore morally wrong. However, the second premise, that we ought to avoid causing needless suffering in animals, contains a premise embedded within it that needless suffering in animals is wrong. Therefore, any moral claim I make that appears to be justified by some normative premises, but no moral premises, is actually justified by suppressed moral premises within those norms. The sixth premise is that because of these suppressed premises, any claim that suffering in all animals is wrong that is justified by normative premises is actually justified by moral premises. You probably already see where this is going. For my moral belief that suffering in all animals is wrong to be justified, I must have some other moral belief in the premises which justifies it. However, according to premise 3, that belief too must be justified by yet more premises, which themselves must be moral, and so on and so forth. This either leads to what is called an infinite regress, where any moral belief is a link in a never-ending chain of beliefs, or circular reasoning, where the conclusion is itself an explicit premise, which is the definition of begging the question. It's not clear how either could be meaningful or non-trivial. And that's where I think I'll end this.